This is not how industrial strategy collapses. There is no vote, no referendum, no congressional hearing where the policy is declared a failure and the architects are held accountable. Industrial strategy collapses the way confidence collapses, through the accumulation of decisions made in boardrooms far from Washington, by executives whose responsibility is to shareholders, not to national interest. And by the time the pattern becomes visible in aggregate data, the capital is already moved, and the infrastructure is already under construction elsewhere. What happened in the third week of January was not a press release, it was a verdict. Volkswagen AG, the largest automotive manufacturer in Europe, and one of the largest industrial corporations in the world, announced that its planned battery production facility for the North American market would be constructed in Ontario, not in the American South. The facility represents a $7 billion investment. It will employ approximately 3,000 workers directly and support an estimated 12,000 jobs across the supply chain. The production capacity, once operational, will supply batteries for electric vehicles sold across North America and potentially for export to other markets. The announcement was framed as a business decision. That framing is accurate, but the business decision was shaped by a political reality that American policymakers spent 2 years creating and are now discovering they cannot control. Most people think this is about tariffs. They are partially correct. But tariffs are the mechanism. The underlying dynamic is about predictability. And predictability, in the language of corporate investment, is the difference between a jurisdiction that attracts capital and a jurisdiction that repels it. For decades, the American South has been the destination of choice for foreign automotive manufacturers seeking access to the North American market. The logic was straightforward. Labor costs were lower than in the unionized industrial Midwest. State governments offered aggressive tax incentives and infrastructure subsidies. The regulatory environment was business-friendly. The market access was unimpeded. NAFTA, and later USMCA, guaranteed that vehicles assembled in the American South could be sold across the continent without tariffs or trade barriers. That logic held through multiple investment cycles. Honda, Toyota, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Hyundai, all of them constructed major production facilities across the southern United States. The infrastructure built around those facilities, the supplier networks, the logistics hubs, the workforce training programs, turned states like Alabama, South Carolina, and Tennessee into integrated nodes of the global automotive supply chain. That integration was built on an assumption. The assumption was that trade policy, however contentious politically, would remain stable enough that long-term capital investments could be planned with confidence. Automotive manufacturing is not a sector where decisions can be reversed quickly. A battery production facility is a fixed asset with a 40-year operational horizon. The supply contracts, the workforce commitments, the infrastructure dependencies, all of it requires certainty that the regulatory and trade environment will not shift in ways that make the investment uneconomic. The tariff threats that dominated American trade policy rhetoric from 2024 onward violated that assumption. The threats were deployed as negotiating tactics. They were intended to pressure trading partners into accepting terms more favorable to American interests. But the side effect, the unintended consequence that no one in Washington appeared to anticipate, was that the threats themselves became a source of uncertainty that made the United States a less attractive destination for exactly the kind of high-value manufacturing investment that the tariffs were supposedly designed to encourage. Volkswagen's decision is a direct result of that uncertainty. The original plan had the battery facility located in Georgia. The site had been selected. Preliminary agreements with state officials had been reached. The workforce recruitment strategy had been outlined. And then the tariff threats escalated. 25% on automotive components, 15% on battery materials. Section 232, national security designations, applied to products that had never been considered security sensitive before. Each announcement, each threat, each revision to the terms created a new variable that Volkswagen's planning teams had to account for. The calculation was not abstract. If Volkswagen built the facility in Georgia and a future administration imposed tariffs on battery imports from Mexico or on lithium compounds from Chile, the entire cost structure of the operation would shift. The facility might become uneconomic overnight. The investment might never generate a return. The shareholders would demand explanations. The executives responsible for the decision would face consequences. Canada offered a different calculation. The regulatory environment in Ontario is stable. The trade relationships are embedded in treaties that have bipartisan support across Canadian political parties. The tax incentives are competitive. The workforce is skilled. And most importantly, the political leadership in Ottawa has spent 2 years signaling in every forum available that Canada is open for business and that the trade rules will not shift arbitrarily based on the political mood of a given week. That signaling mattered. It mattered more than the tax incentives. It mattered more than the labor costs. Because what Volkswagen needed, what every multinational corporation making long-term capital allocation decisions needs, is confidence that the rules will not change midstream. Canada provided that confidence. The United States did not. This is where leverage quietly changes hands. The Volkswagen facility is not just a battery plant. It is anchor investment. Anchor investments attract supplier networks. The companies that produce the cathode materials, the separator films, the thermal management systems, the battery management electronics, all of them will now construct facilities in proximity to the Volkswagen plant to minimize logistics costs and maximize supply chain efficiency. Each of those facilities represents additional capital investment, additional employment, additional tax revenue for Ontario and for Canada. The economic multiplier effects are substantial, but the strategic effects are more consequential, because once the infrastructure is built, once the supply networks are established, once the workforce is trained, the center of gravity for battery production in North America shifts. It shifts from a location that was assumed to be permanent to a location that was built specifically to capture the investment that American trade policy drove away. The pattern is not unique to Volkswagen. In the months following the battery facility announcement, 3 Japanese automotive suppliers announced plans to construct production facilities in Ontario and Quebec. 2 Korean battery manufacturers confirmed they were evaluating Canadian sites for North American expansion. A Chinese battery technology firm, navigating the increasingly hostile regulatory environment for Chinese investment in the United States, selected a location in British Columbia for its first Western Hemisphere research and development center. Each decision was made independently. Each was driven by corporate logic, not by coordinated strategy. But the aggregate effect is the same. The North American battery supply chain, which was assumed to be centered in the American South and the industrial Midwest, is now developing a second pole of gravity in Canada. And once that pole exists, it does not disappear simply because American trade policy becomes more accommodating in a future administration. The political response in Washington has been revealing. There have been no public statements acknowledging that the tariff strategy may have produced outcomes opposite to its stated objectives. There have been no revisions to the approach. Instead, there have been intensified calls for additional tariffs, for more aggressive enforcement, for punitive measures against trading partners who are perceived to be taking advantage of American openness. This is not how policy corrects. This is how policy locks in failure. Because the companies making investment decisions are not ideological, they are not partisan, they are not concerned with national pride or political messaging, they are concerned with return on investment. And when the political environment in one jurisdiction creates risks that do not exist in another jurisdiction, the capital moves. It moves quietly. It moves legally. It moves in ways that are entirely consistent with the rules of market economies. It does not move back simply because politicians decide they made a mistake. The Canadian government understood this dynamic earlier than its American counterpart. The investment attraction strategy that Ontario and Quebec have deployed over the past 3 years has been explicit, consistent, and backed by institutional commitment. The messaging has been simple. Canada is stable. Canada is predictable. Canada is a jurisdiction where long-term investments will not be subject to arbitrary political interference. That messaging was not aimed at voters. It was aimed at corporate executives sitting in boardrooms in Stuttgart, Tokyo, Seoul, and Shanghai. Executives who control capital allocation decisions measured in billions of dollars. Executives who have options. And executives who, when given a choice between a jurisdiction with stable rules and a jurisdiction with volatile politics, will choose stability every time. The Volkswagen decision validates that strategy, and validation attracts more capital. Because investment decisions are not made in isolation. They are made in competitive environments where corporations observe what their peers are doing and adjust accordingly. When Volkswagen announces a $7 billion investment in Ontario, every other automotive manufacturer evaluates whether they are missing an opportunity. When Japanese suppliers follow, the momentum builds. When Korean and Chinese firms begin exploring Canadian sites, the pattern becomes self-reinforcing. This is not a temporary trend. This is a structural shift. The battery facility that Volkswagen is constructing in Ontario will be operational by the end of the decade. According to current timelines, the supply chain investments that follow will take another 3 to 5 years to reach full capacity. By the time the entire ecosystem is operational, Canada will have the largest concentration of battery production capacity outside of Asia. That capacity will serve not just the Canadian market, which is small, but the entire North American market, which is enormous, and potentially export markets beyond. The strategic implications are straightforward. The country that controls battery production controls the economics of electric vehicle manufacturing. Electric vehicles are not a niche market. They are the future of personal transportation. Every major automotive manufacturer has committed to electrification timelines that will see the majority of their production shift to electric powertrains within 15 years. The batteries are the most expensive component of an electric vehicle. The cost of the battery determines the cost of the vehicle. The location of battery production determines where the value is captured. Canada is positioning itself to capture that value. The United States, through trade policies designed to protect domestic manufacturing, has created conditions that push that value creation northward. The irony is not subtle. The tariffs were intended to make American manufacturing more competitive by raising the cost of imports. But the uncertainty created by the tariff threats made American investment less attractive by raising the risk premium. Companies did not respond by building more factories in the United States. They responded by building more factories in jurisdictions where the risk premium was lower. This is not the first time protectionist trade policy has produced outcomes opposite to its intentions. History is filled with examples of tariffs that damaged the industries they were designed to protect, of barriers that accelerated the development of alternative supply chains, of restrictions that made domestic producers less competitive rather than more. The pattern is well documented. It is taught in economics courses. It is understood by trade policy professionals. But understanding the pattern and avoiding the pattern are different things. The political economy of tariffs makes them attractive to policymakers, even when the economic evidence suggests they will fail. Tariffs produce visible benefits for concentrated interests, the domestic producers who gain temporary protection, and impose diffuse costs on broader populations who pay higher prices and suffer reduced economic efficiency. The benefits are immediate. The costs accumulate over time. The political incentives favor announcing the tariffs. The political consequences of the long-term damage appear years later, often under a different administration. The Volkswagen decision is not the long-term damage. It is an early indicator. The long-term damage will be visible in aggregate statistics a decade from now, when the analysis shows that battery production capacity in North America is concentrated in Canada rather than the United States, that automotive supply chains have reorganized around Canadian manufacturing hubs, that the employment and tax revenues that could have flowed to American states are flowing to Canadian provinces instead. By then, the infrastructure will be permanent. The capital will be sunk. The supply relationships will be established. The reversal will be impossible without decades of policy consistency that no democratic system can guarantee. This is not a crisis. It is a reordering. The country that assumed it could dictate terms because its market was too large to ignore is discovering that market size alone is not sufficient leverage when other jurisdictions offer stability, predictability, and institutional competence. The capital goes where it is welcome. The capital goes where the rules are clear. The capital goes where executives can plan for decades rather than reacting to political volatility measured in news cycles. Canada offered all of those things. The United States, for reasons that made sense within a particular political logic, chose not to. And Volkswagen, acting in its own interest, made the decision that corporate logic required. The facility will be built, the jobs will be created, the supply chain will develop, and by the time the political consensus in Washington shifts to acknowledge that the trade strategy failed, the reordering will be complete. History does not reverse because it is misunderstood. By the time this is acknowledged, it will already be normal.